She didn't come here to be destroyed. She came to endure one night. But the man who once swore he loved her cornered her in front of Chicago's most powerful elite, and he tore her apart with a smile. What she didn't know was that someone was watching from the shadows, someone far more dangerous than any enemy she'd ever faced. And what he heard that night would set off a chain of events that would shake the entire city to its foundation. This is the story of a woman who had almost forgotten her own worth, and the man who reminded her of it in the most ruthless way possible. If this story moves you, hit that like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because this is only the beginning. The Blackstone Grand had a way of making people feel small. That was, Vivian Mercer had long suspected, entirely by design. The hotel's grand ballroom was a cathedral built not to honor anything sacred, but to remind every person who walked through its gilded doors exactly where they stood in the hierarchy of Chicago's world. The chandeliers overhead, massive, dripping with Austrian crystal, threw fractured light across 700 square feet of polished marble and old money. The floral arrangements alone cost more than most people's monthly rent. The champagne flowing from silver trays was the kind that came in bottles with French names nobody could pronounce correctly without practice, and every person in attendance had practiced. Vivian stood near the entrance to the main ballroom and took a slow breath. She had dressed carefully tonight, a deep navy gown, cut conservatively, designed to make her disappear into the crowd without apology. Her natural curves, the hips and waist and full chest that had been the subject of Graham's most creative cruelty, were present, unavoidable, hers. She had learned over the years to dress in ways that minimized, that softened, that drew the eye away from the body Graham had spent 3 years methodically teaching her to be ashamed of. The navy gown was an armor she'd been perfecting for a long time, dark enough to recede, structured enough to hold her together. She accepted a glass of champagne from a passing server and didn't drink it. The Aldrich Foundation Gala drew Chicago's top tier every spring, the real estate developers, the hedge fund executives, the city councilmen whose names appeared in the Tribune alongside carefully worded accusations that never quite crystallized into charges. It drew the charitable faces of powerful people, the kind of charitable faces that required a $10,000 ticket to witness. Vivian was here because her firm, Mercer Strategic Communications, handled the foundation's PR account. She was here because her presence was professionally obligatory. She was here because she had promised herself she would not spend another Friday night eating takeout alone on her apartment floor, cataloging everything she'd done wrong in the past decade. She had not anticipated Graham. She should have. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she probably had. Graham Sterling moved through Chicago's philanthropic circuit the way a shark moved through shallow water. Slow enough to seem harmless, always circling something. He ran Sterling Capital Group, a mid-sized private equity firm with a reputation for aggressive acquisition strategies and a carefully cultivated image of respectability. He sat on 3 charitable boards. He had his photograph taken with mayors. He was, by every visible measure, a man of consequence. Vivian had spent 3 years of her life believing in him. She spotted him across the ballroom and felt the familiar shutdown happen in her chest. The quiet, mechanical closing of doors she'd spent 18 months of therapy learning to identify. Her therapist called it a trauma response. Vivian called it survival. Her fingers tightened slightly around the champagne flute she still hadn't touched, and she turned, deliberately, toward the far side of the room where a cluster of foundation board members were gathered near the auction display tables. She made it 40 feet before his voice found her. Vivian. 1 word, 2 syllables. The way he said her name had always carried a particular quality. Not warm, not cold, but calibrated. Precisely tuned to communicate that she had been located, and that her location was now his business. She stopped, considered, for one clear-eyed moment, simply walking forward, pretending she hadn't heard. Her heels were good Italian leather, and the marble floor would have carried the sound of her exit beautifully. Instead, she turned. Graham Sterling looked exactly the way men like him always looked at events like this. Immaculate. Black tie, custom fit, the kind of tailoring that cost enough to announce itself to anyone who knew what to look for. His hair was silver at the temples now, which had only improved him in the way that unfair biology improved certain men as they aged, depositing distinction where it had no business settling. He was smiling. He was always smiling at events. The smile was part of the machinery.
"I didn't realize you'd be here," he said. "It's my account," she said. "Right." He glanced at her glass. "Not drinking?" "I'm working." He nodded slowly, the nod of a man absorbing information he already possessed and was merely performing the reception of. His eyes moved over her in the brief surgical way they always had, a visual inventory conducted with the efficiency of a building inspector noting violations. "You look tired," he said. "I'm fine. I'm just saying, you could have—" He tilted his head slightly. "The Navy is a bit much, don't you think? For your figure?" The ballroom continued around them. 700 people eating and drinking and performing the elaborate social theater of Chicago's elite. Nobody was listening. Nobody ever listened to these particular conversations because they were specifically engineered to sound like nothing to outside ears. "Excuse me," Vivian said. "I'm being honest." His voice dropped a register, not threatening in any way that could be named, simply dropping to the frequency that had always made her feel like the conversation was happening inside her skull rather than between two people. "You always did resist the honest feedback. That was the problem, really. You never wanted to hear what would actually help you." "Graham," her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I need to get back to the foundation. You've put on weight." The words landed the way they always did, not with a crash, but with a specific, quiet precision, like something being placed very carefully on a very delicate surface. She heard them and felt the familiar cascade begin, the heat in her face, the contracting of her throat, the sudden acute awareness of her own body as a public object subject to public judgment. "I'm leaving this conversation," she said. "It's not an insult, I'm trying to help." He stepped slightly to her left, the casual repositioning of a man who understood geometry, who understood that he was now between her and her most natural exit path without it looking like anything but conversational drift. "You represent the foundation. You represent clients. Your presentation matters. And right now, you're not presenting well. I'm the only person in this room who will actually tell you that." "You were always the only person who told me that," she said, "because everyone else is too polite to be useful." "That's not what it was." His smile adjusted by a fraction. "You were always so sensitive. That was the other problem. A woman in your position needs thicker skin, Vivian. You can't build a real career if every piece of honest criticism sends you spiraling." She was not going to cry. She was 34 years old. She was standing in the middle of the Blackstone Grand Ballroom, surrounded by 700 witnesses, and she was not going to cry because Graham Sterling had decided to spend his evening dismantling her again for sport. "You're embarrassing yourself," he said, his voice almost gentle now. "The dress. The way you're carrying yourself tonight. I see it, and I promise you, other people see it too. You've let yourself go and you're pretending you haven't, and that gap between reality and performance, people notice it. They always notice it." Her eyes were burning. She hated that. She hated the specific biological betrayal of eyes that filled in response to cruelty before the rest of her had decided how to respond. "I have to go," she said. She walked. She didn't run because she was Vivian Mercer, and she had built a career on never running, but she walked at a pace that covered distance quickly, and she did not look back, and she did not look at any of the faces she passed, and she moved through a side door she had used before, the one that led to the hotel's original east wing, toward the private spaces the foundation had reserved for the evening, but that remained largely unused during the gala itself. The library was the third door on the left. She'd been in it once before, 2 years ago, during a site walk for the gala setup. It was the kind of room old Chicago money built into its grand hotels, and then quietly forgot. Floor-to-ceiling mahogany shelving, a fireplace that still functioned, leather furniture the color of dark amber. The books on the shelves were real, which was rarer than it should have been in rooms like this. The Aldridge family had been readers, apparently, before they became primarily famous for their net worth. Vivian pushed the door open and stepped inside. The fireplace was burning low, a maintenance concession to ambiance that the event staff had apparently arranged and then abandoned. The light it threw was orange and inconsistent, filling the room with moving shadows and the smell of cedar. Outside, through walls thick enough to muffle everything, the distant sound of the gala orchestra continued its polished work. She crossed to the far end of the room, to the window seat that looked out over the hotel's private garden.
and she gripped the mahogany sill with both hands and she breathed. The champagne glass was still in her hand. She set it down on the sill and pressed her palms flat against the wood and breathed again, slower this time. The deliberate measured breath her therapist had taught her, the one that was supposed to interrupt the cascade before it became a flood. It wasn't working especially well. You've put on weight. She was 34 years old. She had started her own communications firm at 29 with $1,200 and a client list that consisted of 2 nonprofits and 1 very small restaurant that went out of business 3 months later. She had built Mercer Strategic into a firm that now employed 11 people and retained 23 clients, including 3 Fortune 500 companies and the Aldrich Foundation, which was one of the most visible charitable organizations in the Midwest. She had done that herself, with no family money and no connections inherited from anyone, and no partner to split the risk with. And she was standing in a library trembling because a man who had never loved her had called her fat. The sound that came out of her was not a sob exactly. It was more like something releasing, a pressure valve that had been sealed for too long finally giving way. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth and stood there in the firelight and let it happen because she was alone and the room was empty and there was no professional calculus to perform. She stayed like that for a while. Then she became aware that she was not alone. She didn't hear him at first. What she became aware of was a quality of silence, the specific texture of silence that contained a person rather than merely an absence of sound. She turned, not quickly, the way you turn when you're too tired and too exposed to be frightened properly. He was in the far corner of the room. He was seated in one of the leather chairs near the fireplace's opposite end, the one positioned in the deepest shadow, and he had clearly been there since before she entered. He was not hiding, exactly. He was simply occupying space the way certain men occupied space, with a stillness so complete it bordered on the architectural. He looked like something the room had built around. He was watching her. Not the way Graham had watched her, not the inventory look, not the assessment. Something different, something that Vivian, in that first exposed moment, could not quite name. "I'm sorry," she said, and her voice came out rough. "I didn't realize anyone was in here." He said nothing. "I'll go," she said. "You don't have to." His voice was low and had the particular quality of a voice that was accustomed to rooms becoming quiet around it. Not loud, not performed, simply weighted, the way certain statements were weighted, not by volume, but by the certainty behind them. She stood where she was. "How long have you been sitting there?" she asked. "Long enough," he said. The firelight shifted and she could see him more clearly now. He was tall, even seated, she could tell by the proportions of him. Broad through the shoulders, with the kind of physical presence that came not from bulk alone, but from something harder to quantify. Something in the way he occupied the chair as though the chair had been specifically constructed for him. He was dark hair, dark complexion, dark suit that fit him the way expensive things fit people who wore expensive things habitually. His face was the face of a man somewhere in his early 40s, angular, not conventionally handsome, but arresting in the way that certain faces were arresting, the ones that carried experience in their architecture. He had dark eyes. They were fixed on her with an attention that was, she realized, completely without the social pretenses she was accustomed to from men at events like this. No performance of polite inattention, no careful averting of gaze to protect her dignity. He was simply looking at her directly, as though she were something worth looking at directly. It was, absurdly, the most seen she had felt all evening. "You heard," she said. It wasn't really a question. "Everything after 'I didn't realize you'd be here,'" he said. She absorbed that, the specific hot mortification of having been witnessed in that particular vulnerability had a weight to it. She picked up her champagne from the windowsill and drank it, finally, in a single long swallow. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. She turned back to the window. The garden below was dark and empty, the landscape lighting leaving pools of amber across the clipped hedgerows. She was trying to decide what she wanted to do with the information that she had been overheard, whether to be angry about it, whether to perform the dignified exit she should have performed at the start. "He does that," she said, not entirely sure why she was still talking. "I gathered. He's very good at it. He finds the exact—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "It doesn't matter." "What's his name?" She turned back. He was still watching her from the shadows, completely still. Why? Because I'd like to know it. Something in the directness of that stopped her. There was no social framing around it, no polite reason offered. He simply wanted to know, and he said so. Graham Sterling, she said. He said nothing, but something in the quality of his stillness shifted, very slightly. A refinement, not a reaction, the way a calculation updates when new data arrives. And you are? She asked. He rose from the chair.
He was, as she'd estimated, very tall. He moved across the room toward the fireplace with the kind of unhurried deliberateness that communicated something specific about who he was. Not hurried, not performing, simply moving with the absolute certainty that the space around him would accommodate his movement. He stopped near the fireplace and turned to look at her fully, and in the full firelight she could see his face clearly now. Dante, he said. Dante Moretti. The name arrived in her consciousness, and then the name arrived in her memory, and then the two things met and produced a specific cold clarity. Dante Moretti. She had worked in Chicago's power corridors long enough to have assembled an internal map of who the real forces were. Not the philanthropists and the politicians and the hedge fund managers, but the actual structural forces beneath the city's visible surface, the ones whose power didn't require press releases. She knew the names you weren't supposed to say casually. She knew the names that appeared in Tribune investigations that never resulted in charges because the people pressing charges had a way of reassessing their positions. Dante Moretti was not just one of those names, he was the name. The head of the Moretti organization, which had held the Midwest's most significant criminal territories for the better part of 2 decades. The man that federal investigators had been building files on for 11 years without a single successful prosecution. The man that Chicago's actual power brokers, the ones with the titles and the foundations and the gala tickets, maneuvered carefully around, politely, the way you navigated around a geological feature that predated the city and would outlast it. She was standing alone in a firelit library with Dante Moretti, and he had heard every word Graham Sterling said to her, and he had asked for Graham's name. "Oh," she said. "Yes," he said. Her heart was doing something complicated. The part of her brain that assessed situations professionally, the part that had kept her alive and functional in high-stakes environments for over a decade, was producing very clear and specific information. She should leave this room. She should leave it now, politely, without provoking anything, and she should go back into the ballroom and finish her professional obligations and go home. And she should not think about this again. "I should go back," she said. "You should," he agreed. Neither of them moved. The fire popped softly. Outside, the orchestra continued. "He does this at every event," she said. "He finds me. I don't know if he plans it or if it's opportunistic, but he always finds me." She wasn't sure why she was still talking. The words were coming out with the particular momentum of things that had been held too long. 3 years we were together. 3 years. And I knew something was wrong. But he was very good at making me believe the problem was me. He had this way of framing it as care, honest feedback, wanting the best for me. You believe it when someone says they love you. You want to believe the concern is real. Dante was watching her the way he'd watched her from the shadow, directly, completely, without the performed sympathy that she would have expected, and that would have made her stop talking. You believe, she continued, that if someone who claims to love you says something is wrong with you, it has to be more reliable than your own reading of yourself, because love is supposed to see you clearly. He used that. He used the premise of love to get me to... She stopped. "I'm sorry. I don't know why I'm telling you this." "Keep going," he said. "I've spent 1.5 years undoing it. Therapy, work, building the firm, trying to remember what I was before him." She looked at her empty champagne glass. "And then he's just here, in the same room, and 20 seconds with him, and I'm back in it. That's the part I can't forgive myself for. How fast it happens." "That's not a failure," Dante said. "It feels like one." "What it is," he said carefully, crossing his arms over his chest with the unhurried ease of a man who considered his words before deploying them, is evidence of how thorough he was. What he did wasn't casual cruelty. It was systematic. That kind of damage doesn't heal because you've decided you're healed. It heals on its own schedule." He paused. "And it's not your fault it was done." She looked at him. He looked back. "You don't know me," she said.
"No," he agreed, "but I know what I heard tonight, and I know the difference between a man with an honest opinion and a man who has spent years studying exactly where to press to produce a specific result." The silence between them had a different quality now. Not the heavy silence of exposure, but something more difficult to categorize. "What do you want from this conversation?" she asked directly. He considered that for a moment. "Nothing you're not willing to give." "That's not an answer. It's the only accurate one." He uncrossed his arms and turned slightly toward the door. "Come back to the ballroom." "Why?" "Because you came here to work, and because walking back in there alone after what just happened is survivable but unnecessary." He paused at the door. "Walk back in with me." She stood very still. The rational assessment was clear. Dante Moretti was not a safe person to be publicly associated with. He was a man whose proximity came with implications that her professional life, her clients, her carefully constructed legitimacy could not afford. She knew this. She was the person, professionally, who managed implications for a living. She crossed the room and took the arm he offered. His arm was solid under her hand, not the performative solidity of a man aware he was being touched, but simply the physical substance of someone whose body meant what it said. He opened the library door and they stepped into the corridor, and she took one breath, and then they were moving toward the ballroom. The effect was immediate. They came through this main entrance and the nearest conversation simply stopped. Not dramatically, not with gasps or pointed fingers. The conversation stopped the way conversation stopped when something significant entered the room and the people nearest to it became instantly, involuntarily aware of it before they'd processed why. A ripple effect, spreading outward from the entrance in concentric circles of redirected attention. People she'd known for years looked at her as though seeing her for the first time, not because of who she was, because of who was beside her and what his unhurried presence communicated about who she was to him. She kept her chin level, she kept her shoulders back. The heat of collective attention was different from the heat of shame. She was discovering this in real time. It was warmer, less corrosive, lit from outside rather than burning from within. She felt Dante guide her slightly, a barely perceptible pressure through the hand she'd tucked through his arm, and she realized they were moving with specific direction, not simply circulating. They were moving toward Graham. She recognized the geography of it in the moment before she might have had the chance to redirect anything. The crowd was parting, genuinely, physically parting, and she could see Graham across the 30 feet of marble between them, standing with a cluster of business associates near the auction display, his back partially turned, unaware of what was approaching. Someone in the cluster saw Dante first. She watched the information transfer through the group like current through water. The slight widening of eyes, the subtle recalibration of posture, the way two of the men near Graham took a half step that was not quite backing away but was the socially careful approximation of it. And then Graham, reading the changed energy of his own conversational cluster, turned. The color that left his face was not subtle. It left the way color leaves something that has been placed in cold water. Gradually, then all at once. Dante stopped. Vivian stood beside him. The silence in their immediate vicinity had grown to encompass perhaps 50 people, the nearest rings of Chicago's most powerful figures, all of whom had suddenly discovered the area around Graham Sterling to be of intense interest. "Graham Sterling," Dante said. His voice carried without elevation. It was the voice of a man who didn't need volume, because volume was the tool of people who weren't certain of being heard. Graham's mouth moved without producing anything. "I was in the library tonight," Dante said. "The one off the East Corridor." A pause. "You should be more careful about where you choose to have certain conversations." Graham looked at Vivian, then back at Dante, then at the ring of witnesses around them. "I'm not sure what you think you heard," he started. "I heard everything," Dante said simply. "The comment about her dress, her figure, her weight, her career, her sensitivity." He tilted his head very slightly. "Did I miss anything?" The silence was absolute. Graham Sterling, the man who sat on 3 charitable boards, who had his photograph taken with mayors, who had spent 3 years convincing Vivian Mercer that she was the problem with everything, stood in the middle of Chicago's most prestigious social gathering,
and had nowhere to go. I think there may have been a misunderstanding, Graham said. There wasn't, Dante said. The two words were delivered with a finality that had no aggression in it and needed none. They were simply the closing of a matter that was not open for discussion. Vivian watched Graham's eyes move to her. She recognized the look in them. The calculation of a man who was trying to determine whether there was a version of this situation he could manage his way out of. She had spent 3 years watching him calculate his way out of situations. She knew the look intimately. Vivian. Graham's voice found the particular frequency of private grievance performed publicly. I've always spoken to you as a friend. If something I said tonight came across... Stop, she said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. But in the silence of the room, quiet carried perfectly. Don't, she said. Not here. Not in front of... Just don't. Graham looked back at Dante. This woman, Dante said, his voice unchanged, is under my personal protection. That's not a threat. It's a fact. Act accordingly. The word protection landed in the room with a weight that everyone present understood, and that required no elaboration. In certain registers of Chicago's power structure, protection meant what it said. These people knew enough to know that. Graham swallowed. Of course, he said. His voice had lost something, some essential mechanical component. Of course. Vivian, I apologize. If anything I said tonight was hurtful, I'm genuinely sorry. The apology was worse than the insult, in a specific way. It was the apology of a man who had calculated that the apology was cheaper than the alternative and had produced it as efficiently as a receipt. Vivian had heard his apologies before. She recognized this one's genus. I know, she said. Which wasn't forgiveness. Which wasn't absolution. Which was simply acknowledgement that she had heard him produce the required sounds and that she was finished with the conversation. Dante touched her hand once. A brief contact, nothing performed about it. And then they were moving again, and the crowd was opening around them with the same tide-like quality as before, and Vivienne kept her chin level and her shoulders back and walked through the Blackstone Grand Ballroom beside the most dangerous man in the Midwest while 700 people watched and remembered. Later, when the gala was winding toward its close and the auction paddles had been put away and the orchestra was finishing its last set, Dante found her near the windows on the ballroom's south side. I'm having my car brought around, he said. I'd like to see you home. She looked at him for a moment. That's not something I typically accept from people I've just met, she said. I know. You're also not someone whose offer is entirely uncomplicated. Also true, he said. So why are you offering? He considered the question with the same unhurried deliberateness he appeared to apply to everything. Because you shouldn't have to go home alone tonight with his voice in your head, he said. That's the only reason. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in recent memory. She nodded. They left through the hotel's private entrance, the one that led to the reserved car line. The night was April cold, the kind of Chicago cold that lingered past reason, and the city's lights reflected off the low clouds above the lakefront in a wash of amber and silver. His car was a black Mercedes, understated for who he was, and his driver opened the door without being asked. During the drive to her apartment on the north side, they talked, not about Graham, not about the gala, about the city, about the way Chicago changed personality block by block, about the particular texture of the lakeshore at night, about the firm she'd built and the work she actually believed in, and the clients who frustrated her most. He listened with the quality of attention she'd noticed in the library, complete, unhurried, without the social performance of interest. He told her almost nothing about himself, which she noted. When the car stopped outside her building, he got out and held the door. Thank you, she said. He nodded. She took 3 steps toward her building's entrance and then stopped. Dante. He was still standing beside the car, hands in his jacket pockets, watching her with the particular quality of attention that she was beginning to think might be simply how he looked at things he considered worth looking at. What did you say to him? She asked. At the end, when you leaned down, what did you say to Graham? He held her gaze for a moment. Nothing that needs to concern you, he said. That's not reassuring. It wasn't designed to be reassuring, he said. Good night, Vivian. She stood on the sidewalk and watched the car pull away into the city. She went upstairs, made tea,
sat by the window with the city's amber light falling across the kitchen floor, and thought about the evening with the particular clarity that came after very strange days. She went to sleep just before 2. She was not thinking about Dante Moretti when she fell asleep. She was thinking about the way the room had parted when they walked in together, the way it had felt, just for a moment, to move through a space without having to brace for impact. She'd forgotten what that felt like. She was remembering. 3 miles south, in a Federal Plaza office, a server somewhere received the first of 12 encrypted file transfers. The files contained transaction records, shell company registrations, offshore account histories, and communication spanning 7 years of Graham Sterling's private financial life, the version of that life he had never allowed to appear in any public document. The transfers came from a source that would take federal investigators weeks to begin tracing. By the time she woke the next morning and checked the Tribune's business section over her first cup of coffee, the first stories were already appearing. She sat with her coffee going cold and read the words: Federal Inquiry, Sterling Capital Group, accounts frozen, and felt something she couldn't immediately name. It wasn't satisfaction, exactly. It wasn't fear. It was the particular sensation of understanding that something had been set in motion long before she realized the machinery was already running, and that the man who had smiled at her from the shadows of a firelit library had, without asking permission, without offering explanation, quietly demolished the next 12 months of Graham Sterling's life between the hours of midnight and sunrise. She set her coffee cup down very carefully. Her phone was already ringing. She looked at the screen. Unknown number, she answered. "Good morning," said Dante Moretti. She almost didn't answer. Her thumb hovered over the screen for 2 full seconds, long enough to think, long enough to know that answering was a decision with weight to it, long enough to understand that the Tribune article on the table in front of her was not a coincidence, and that the man on the other end of this call had made it happen before dawn while she was sleeping, and that none of this was uncomplicated. She answered. "How did you get this number?" she asked. "Good morning to you too," Dante said. "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It's not. Did you see the Tribune?" She looked at the paper, at the headline, at the words Federal Inquiry sitting above Graham Sterling's professionally photographed face, the face of a man who had not yet learned the morning's news when that photograph was taken. "I'm looking at it right now," she said. "Good. Did you do that?" A pause. Not long, not evasive. The pause of a man who was choosing the precise version of the truth he intended to offer. "I made certain information available to people who were positioned to act on it," he said. "That's a very careful sentence." "I'm a careful man." She stood up from this kitchen table and moved to the window. The north side was already moving. Dog walkers, the early commuters, a delivery truck idling outside the coffee shop on the corner. The city that did not know what had happened overnight and was proceeding accordingly. "You should know," she said, "that I didn't ask you to do that." "I know. And I'm not—" She pressed 2 fingers against her forehead. "I'm not comfortable being the reason someone's life gets dismantled." "You're not the reason," Dante said. "Graham Sterling's own decisions over the past 7 years are the reason. I simply ensured those decisions found the audience they deserved." "That's another careful sentence." "It's also accurate." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the delivery truck finished its business and pulled away. "Why are you calling?" she asked. "To ask if you'd have dinner with me tonight." She turned from the window. "Dante. Vivian. You understand what you're asking. You understand what being seen with you publicly implies." "I understand it better than you do," he said, "and I'm asking anyway." She thought about the ballroom. She thought about the way 50 people had gone silent in concentric rings. She thought about Graham's face draining of color. She thought about the car ride home and the city lights and the conversation that had felt, inexplicably, like the first honest conversation she'd had in longer than she could accurately measure. She thought about the Tribune headline. "Not tonight," she said. "Give me some time." Another pause. "All right," he said. "That's it? Just all right?" "I don't negotiate invitations," he said. "You'll call when you're ready, or you won't." He ended the call. She stood at the window with the phone in her hand and the cold April light coming through the glass and the Tribune on the table behind her, and the sensation, persistent, inconvenient, of being in the early stages of something she did not yet have a name for. Her assistant, Priya, called at 8:45. "Have you seen the Tribune?" Priya said before hello. "Yes." "Sterling Capital Group, Federal Inquiry?" "Vivian, you handled their competitor's account 2 years ago. The Caldwell Group. You have 4 mutual contacts with Sterling's people. If this blows up into a full investigation, it won't touch the firm," Vivian said. "How do you know?" "Because I've never done anything for Graham that required burying. Our relationship was personal, not professional. There's no crossover."
"Your relationship?" Priya was quiet for a beat. "You were at the gala last night. He was at the gala last night. And this morning, he's on the front page of the business section with federal investigators pulling his accounts." Another beat. "Vivian, what happened last night?" "A complicated evening," Vivian said. "I'll brief you when I'm in." She was in the office by 9:30.
Mercer Strategic occupied the 14th floor of a building on Michigan Avenue, a real office, the kind she'd worked toward for years, with glass walls and a conference room and 11 people who depended on her to hold the roof up. She walked through it the way she walked through everything professional, with the particular composure that was not performed, but was, at this point, structural, so deeply built into how she moved through workspaces that it operated independently of whatever was happening inside her. She sat through a 10 o'clock client call about a healthcare nonprofit's rebranding timeline. She reviewed copy for a tech company's product launch. She approved a media pitch. She did the work with the portion of herself that had always been reliable and separate, the professional mechanism that ran on its own fuel. At noon, Priya appeared in her office doorway with the face of someone carrying information they were uncertain how to deliver. "Marcus Hale is here," Priya said. Vivian looked up. Marcus Hale was Graham Sterling's head of communications. Had been for 6 years. He was a compact, precise man in his early 40s who wore his loyalty to Graham with the same consistency he wore his uniform of charcoal suits and silver tie clips. He and Vivian had navigated the same professional circuits for years. Cordial, careful, the specific cordiality of two people who understood they were proxies for larger interests. "Send him in," she said. He came in looking like a man who had not slept. His charcoal suit was present. The silver tie clip was present. But the quality of his composure had shifted. She could see the maintenance cost written in the set of his jaw, the slight over-precision of his movements. "Marcus," she said. "Sit down." "I'll stand." He looked at the chair anyway, then sat. "Graham wants to talk to you." "That's not a conversation I'm available for." "Vivian, I was very clear last night," she said. "Last night." Marcus leaned forward slightly. His hands were clasped on her desk, a posture she recognized as his version of controlled urgency. "Last night you were at a gala with Dante Moretti. This morning Graham has federal investigators pulling 7 years of records. You understand how those two facts look sitting next to each other." "I understand how they look," she said. "Then you understand why Graham needs to speak with you." "What Graham needs," she said carefully, "is a very good lawyer, which I imagine he already has several of. He does not need to speak with me. He thinks you can—" "I can't do anything for him, Marcus. I don't have anything to do." She held his gaze steadily. "I had a conversation with someone at a charity event. I have no knowledge of how that conversation relates to anything the federal government has decided to investigate, and I have no intention of being inserted into whatever narrative Graham is constructing to explain his current situation." Marcus looked at her for a long moment. "You were with Moretti," he said, "in front of 200 witnesses. I was escorted across a ballroom by a man I met at an event. That's not a criminal act, Marcus. Moretti isn't just a man. I know who he is. Do you?" He sat back. The controlled urgency was giving way to something more unguarded. She could see the man behind the communications professional, and the man was genuinely alarmed. "Vivian, he's not someone you can have a complicated night with and step back from cleanly. These people don't work that way. Once you're visible to them—" "Marcus?" Her voice came out harder than she'd intended, and she let it. "Graham spent 3 years making me feel like my judgment couldn't be trusted. I'm asking you, as someone who has always been professionally decent to me, not to continue that project on his behalf." The room went quiet. Marcus sat very still. "That's not what I'm doing," he said finally. "Then tell Graham I'm unavailable. Tell him to focus on his attorneys. Tell him I wish him whatever luck the situation allows." She paused. And please close the door on your way out. He left. She sat at her desk for a moment after the door clicked shut and breathed with the measured deliberateness of someone maintaining altitude in turbulent conditions. Then she picked up her phone and looked at the unknown number from the morning's call. She did not call it back. She went home at 6:30, changed out of her work clothes, and stood in her kitchen making pasta because pasta was the thing she made when she needed to do something with her hands. She chopped the garlic finely and heated the oil and stood over the pan with the particular presence of someone trying to stay inside a domestic moment and mostly succeeding. Her phone rang at 7:15. Unknown number. She answered without thinking about it. The same autopilot that had answered at 8 that morning. The same 2-second hesitation overridden by the same thing she wasn't entirely ready to name. I told you I needed time, she said. I know, Dante said. This isn't about dinner. Something in the quality of his voice was different. Not cold, not alarmed, but stripped of the particular measured ease she'd identified as characteristic. What's wrong? She asked.
Graham Sterling made some calls today. She turned the heat down on the pan. To whom? To people who do not like my name appearing in newspaper stories adjacent to federal investigations, even tangentially. A pause. He suggested to certain parties that my interest in you was related to his situation, that I had a professional motive for humiliating him publicly. That's not... I know what it is and what it isn't, Dante said. I'm telling you because these parties will look for a way to apply pressure, and the most direct pressure point is you. She set the wooden spoon down on the counter. What does that mean, practically? It means you need to be careful about who approaches you in the next few days. Anyone you don't know who wants to discuss last night, or Moretti, or Graham's situation, you tell me before you respond to them. Not after. Dante, she kept her voice even. I'm a communications professional. I manage information for a living. I know how to handle approaches. You know how to handle corporate and nonprofit approaches, he said. What's coming isn't that. The garlic was browning in the pan, and she wasn't doing anything about it. You're scaring me, she said. Good, he said. Appropriate level of awareness is protective. That's a deeply unsettling thing to say. I know. And then, with a shift so slight she almost missed it, I didn't intend for any of this to touch you. The investigation, I expected it to move quietly. Behind the visible layer, Graham escalated it by making those calls, and now it's more visible than I planned. She absorbed that. You're telling me you made a miscalculation. Yes. And that the miscalculation has consequences for me. Yes. She looked at the browning garlic and did not feel anything particularly simple. I'll be careful, she said. Vivian, I hear you. I'll be careful. After she hung up, she turned the pan off and stood in the kitchen for a while without eating anything. She thought about 3 things in rotation. Marcus Hale's alarmed face, the Tribune headline, and the particular quality of Dante's voice when he said, I didn't intend for any of this to touch you. The stripped version, the one underneath the measured weight that characterized everything else he said. She thought about the fact that she had answered both calls. She thought about the fact that she already knew what she was going to decide before she was ready to admit she was deciding it. The next morning, she called the unknown number. He answered on the second ring. Dinner, she said. A brief pause. Tonight, he said. Tonight. He gave her the name of a restaurant, not the kind of name that appeared in magazine roundups of Chicago's best tables, but the kind that appeared in the private knowledge of people who operated in specific registers of the city, the kind that had no sign and required a name at the door. She wore a dress that was not navy. It was deep burgundy, a color she had bought 18 months ago and kept in her closet without wearing because it was the kind of dress that announced presence rather than minimizing it, and she had not been ready to announce anything. She put it on and stood in front of the mirror for 30 seconds and went out the door. The restaurant occupied the upper floor of a building in the West Loop, reached by a private elevator that required a key card. When the doors opened, she stepped into a space of dark wood and low amber light, a room of perhaps 12 tables, half of them occupied by the kind of people who did not check their phones and who looked up when she entered with the measured appraisal of individuals accustomed to knowing exactly who was in any given room. Dante was standing at the far end, near a window that ran the full width of the building overlooking the city's lit grid. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the library, directly,
without the social performance of appraisal. Just looking. And something about being looked at that way in this dress, in this room, on this particular evening, produced a warmth in her chest that she acknowledged and then carefully set aside for later examination. They sat. The dinner was 2 hours. She learned over the course of those 2 hours the things Dante chose to tell her about himself, which were not many, but which were chosen with the specificity of a man who gave information deliberately. He had grown up in Chicago's South Side. His father had been a man whose particular business left particular options available to the son who inherited his connections, and his position at 22 when those connections required a new address. He had been running the Moretti organization for 19 years. He had never been married. Never? She asked. It wouldn't have been kind, he said, to whoever. That's an interesting way to frame it. It's an accurate way. He looked at his wine glass. The life isn't compatible with, he paused, certain things. And now, he looked up. I don't know, he said, which was, she was learning, his version of a significant statement. They were on the last of the wine when his phone vibrated once on the table. He glanced at it with the peripheral attention of a man who monitored information the way some people monitored weather, constantly and without making it the main event. And something in his expression made a very small adjustment. Problem? She asked. Possibly. He set the phone face down. Tell me something. Graham's company. Sterling Capital Group. Do you know who his silent partners were? Any of them? The shift in topic was abrupt enough that she felt it. Why? Because 2 of the names in the federal filing are connected to people I have a specific history with. And if Graham was working with those people, then his call yesterday didn't go to random pressure points. It went to people who have been waiting for an excuse. She set her wine glass down. Dante, what does that mean? He looked at her for a moment with the look she was beginning to read as his version of weighing the cost of honesty. It means, he said slowly, that Graham Sterling was not simply a private equity executive with some buried financial crimes. He was also, it appears, functioning as a financial channel for people who have been interested in dismantling the Moretti organization's legitimate holdings for approximately 3 years. He paused. Which means the night at the gala was not the coincidence I believed it was. The restaurant was very quiet around them. You think he knew who you were when he came to talk to me? She said. I think it's possible. And you think he... She stopped. The architecture of it was assembling itself in her mind with the cold mechanical clarity that arrived when professional pattern recognition applied itself to personal situations. You think he sought me out at the gala specifically, because he knew there was a chance you'd be there and a chance you'd be watching? Dante said nothing, which was its own answer. He used me, she said. I don't know that. You just told me. I told you it's possible. I don't have confirmation. His voice was careful. But I needed you to know the possibility exists before you decide how far into this you want to... Her phone was buzzing on the table. Priya. At 9:47 in the evening, she answered. There are 2 men in the lobby of your building, Priya said, and her voice had the particular quality of someone who was keeping it together by the narrowest margin. They came to the office first, after hours. The cleaning crew called me. They said they were looking for you. Vivian, they didn't look like... They didn't look like what? Vivian said. The line had a quality to it that she recognized. Not dead, not dropped, but the specific suspended silence of someone who had stopped mid-sentence because something in their immediate environment had changed. Priya. I have to go, Priya said, and the call ended. Vivian was already standing. Dante was watching her with the complete stillness of a man whose internal machinery had shifted register without his face reflecting the transition. He had heard enough from her side of the call. She could see in the economy of his movements, the way his hand moved to his jacket's interior, the way his eyes went briefly to the restaurant's entrance, and then to the window and then back to her, that he was doing the rapid structural assessment of a man for whom threat evaluation was not a learned skill, but a native one. My assistant, Vivian said, 2 men at my building. She was at the office after hours and they... She stopped. The call dropped. Dante was already on his phone. He spoke in a low, clipped exchange. 2 sentences, a pause, 1 more sentence, and pocketed the phone. My people are 10 minutes from your building, he said. And Priya,
Address of your office. She gave it. He made a second call, shorter than the first. Someone will reach her, he said. Come.
They moved through the restaurant and she registered the faces turning as they passed, the measured appraisal of the other diners recalibrating as Dante crossed the room with a quality of directed motion that communicated to every person in it that the evening's careful social equilibrium had been replaced by something operational. The car was waiting at the building's side entrance. In the back seat, moving through the West Loop's nighttime grid, Vivian sat with her hands pressed flat against her thighs and breathed with the measured deliberateness of someone who understood that the alternative to controlled breathing was the kind of unraveling that would not serve her right now. My building, she said. We're not going to your building. Those are my... Vivian. His voice was not loud. If they're at your building is not where you should be tonight. You understand that. She understood it. Understanding it produced a specific cold clarity that was not the same thing as accepting it. Where are we going? Somewhere they don't know. She looked out the window at the city moving past. Streets she knew, intersections she had driven through 1,000 times. The ordinary architecture of her daily life proceeding outside the glass with no knowledge that anything had shifted. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. But not Dante's unknown number. A different one. She looked at it. Answer it, Dante said. She answered. Ms. Mercer. The voice was male, middle register, the particular flatness of someone who had practiced conducting conversations that the recipient did not want to be having. My name is not important. I want you to know that your assistant is fine. She's in her car. She's driving home. Nobody has touched her. I want that to be clear up front. Vivian's jaw tightened. Who is this? Someone who has been watching the situation with Mr. Moretti develop with some concern. We'd like to speak with you privately. Not tonight. We understand the timing is poor, but soon. If you've been near my assistant... We spoke with her briefly. We asked her to pass along a message. She made her own decision to call you instead. A pause. She's a loyal person. You've built a good team. I want to be very clear, Vivian said, that I don't know who you are. I don't know what situation you think I'm involved in, and I have nothing to discuss with anonymous callers. You're currently in a car with Dante Moretti, the voice said. Heading, I'd guess, somewhere he considers secure. Ms. Mercer, the situation you're in is not one you chose carefully, and there are things about the man beside you that you don't know yet. Another pause. When you learn them, you'll want to have had this conversation before you did. The call ended. She lowered the phone. Dante was watching her without pretending he hadn't been. Who was that? He said. Not a question. He didn't give a name. She looked at him directly. He said, there are things about you I don't know. He said, when I find out, I'll wish I'd talked to him first. Dante's expression did not change in any visible way, but the quality of his stillness shifted. The same micro-adjustment she'd noticed in the restaurant, the calibration of a man receiving information and updating an internal calculation. He's not wrong, Dante said. The car continued through the city. Vivian felt something cold settle in her sternum. What does that mean? She said. It means there are things I haven't told you. He held her gaze steadily. Not because I intended to deceive you, because the timing hadn't... Dante. She kept her voice level with the specific effort of a woman who had spent years learning to keep her voice level when every instinct said otherwise. What are they? He looked at her for a long moment. Not in the car, he said. The car took them north, then east, eventually pulling through a gate that Vivian didn't recognize into a private structure attached to a building on the lakefront. Old money architecture, the kind that predated steel and glass, brick and setback from the street with the particular confidence of buildings that didn't need to announce themselves. They went up in a private elevator. The apartment was the top floor, not ostentatious, which surprised her, but that particular register of expensive that expressed itself through quality of material rather than volume of display. Books. Real ones, like the library. A window wall facing the lake that in daylight would have been extraordinary, and at night was a field of black water and distant lights. She stood in the center of the main room and waited. Dante went to a cabinet and poured 2 glasses of water. He brought them to the low table and sat. She sat across from him in a chair, her burgundy dress catching the room's low light, her hands folded in her lap with a stillness she was manufacturing through effort. Graham Sterling, Dante said, was not a random person who wandered into the gala. You said that at dinner. I said it was possible. I'm telling you now it's confirmed. He looked at the water glass. In the last 2 hours, while we were eating, my people identified 2 of the shell companies in the federal filing. They trace back to an organization called the Valenti Group, Northeastern Interests. They've been attempting to acquire leverage over certain Moretti holdings for 3 years by running capital through legitimate fronts. He paused. Graham Sterling's firm was one of those fronts. Vivian was quiet. Graham knew you, Dante continued. Not casually. He researched you. He knew your background, your client list, your history with the foundation. He knew you'd be at that gala. He looked up. He also knew that I attend the foundation event most years, quietly, not on any guest list. The cold thing in her sternum spread. He set it up, she said. He created the conditions, Dante said carefully. Whether he expected the specific outcome, he humiliated me in front of witnesses knowing you might see it. The words came out flat, not loud, each one placed with the precision of someone who needed to hear a thing said aloud to confirm it was real. He knew what you'd do. He knew you'd respond to it. And he used me to... She stopped. The thing she was feeling was not simple enough to be one thing. It had layers she was sorting through with the rapid mechanical triage of a mind that was very good at processing complex information and was currently applying that skill to its own pain. 3 years. 3 years of Graham telling her she wasn't enough, that she was too sensitive, that her body was wrong, and her judgment was poor, and her instincts couldn't be trusted. And now the architecture of even that was shifting. The question arriving unbidden and terrible. How much of those 3 years had been preparation for a single evening's use? Had she ever been anything to Graham Sterling except a variable in a calculation? Vivian, Dante said. Give me a minute, she said. He gave it. She sat in the chair in her burgundy dress with the lake invisible behind the dark glass and breathed through the specific quality of devastation that arrived not with tears, but with a kind of internal structural settling, the sound things made when they finished falling. The men at my building, she said finally, Valenti's people, attempting to determine how much you know and whether you're an asset or a liability. And Priya, they approached her as a message, to establish they could reach you through your life. His voice was level, but there was something beneath the level quality, a tightness, contained, controlled. That was a mistake on their part. A mistake how? Because it tells me they're moving faster than they should, which means they're not as controlled as they want to appear. He stood and moved to the window. And because I don't respond well to people using proximity to threaten what's mine. The word mine landed in the room. She heard it. She did not address it. She filed it in the part of her mind marked later. There's something else, she said. She could see it in the set of his shoulders at the window. The specific quality of a man carrying a disclosure he had not yet made. Tell me, she said. He turned. The gala, he said. My presence there. I told you I attend most years. That's true. He held her gaze. I also knew Graham Sterling's name before you gave it to me in the library. The room was very quiet. You knew him, she said. I knew of him. I knew what he was connected to, what he'd been running for the Valenti Group. He kept his voice even. I had been building the federal case file for 4 months. I was waiting for the right moment to release it. She stood up, and the gala was where I'd arranged for a federal contact to be present. Someone positioned to receive the file transfer and move on it within 24 hours. He paused. I was in the library that night because the East Corridor provided direct access to the Foundation's private office, where I needed to be briefly. I was not there because of you. She looked at him across the room. But you heard me, she said. Yes. And everything after that was real, he said. What I said to you in the library, walking back in, the car ride tonight. He didn't look away. All of it was real, and none of it was planned. But you deserve to know that I walked into that building already knowing who Graham Sterling was and what he'd been doing. The information rearranged itself in her mind with a slow, grinding precision. He had known. He had listened to her pour 3 years of pain into a firelit room, and he had known the entire time that the man causing that pain was also professionally connected to an operation Dante had been working to dismantle for months. He had offered her his arm and walked her back into that ballroom, knowing that the confrontation served his purposes as cleanly as it served hers. "Did it benefit you?" she said. "The scene with Graham, the public declaration." Dante was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "It put Graham on notice in front of witnesses. It accelerated his panic. His panic led to the calls that revealed his Valenti connections more clearly than the file alone would have." He paused. "It also benefited you. Both things are true simultaneously." "You used me," she said. The words came out with a flatness that was worse than heat. "No." His voice had an edge now, the first real edge she'd heard. "I responded to a situation that was already happening. I did not manufacture your pain. I did not create Graham's cruelty. I made a decision, in a library, to involve myself in something I was not obligated to involve myself in. And yes, it served more than one purpose. That's not use. That's how every decision made by real people in real situations works. You could have told me." "When?" He took a step toward her. "In the library, while you were breaking apart, in the car, at dinner tonight, before your assistant called? When exactly was the moment where telling you produced anything except panic before you had any way to protect yourself from the consequences?" She wanted to find an answer to that. She looked for it honestly, and it wasn't cleanly there, which made her angrier than if it had been. "The choice should have been mine," she said. "Yes," he said. "It should have. I'm not arguing that." The simple acknowledgement hit differently than a defense would have. She stood with it for a moment. "I need to call Priya," she said. "Of course." She moved to the window and made the call. Priya answered on the first ring, her voice compressed with relief and residual adrenaline. She was home, she was fine. 2 men had stopped her in the office parking structure and asked about Vivian's schedule and her associations and whether she had been in contact with anyone new recently. She had told them nothing and driven away. "Go somewhere else tonight," Vivian told her. "Not your apartment, a friend's. Call me when you're there." She ended the call and stood at the window looking at the dark lake. "I can't go home," she said. "No." "My office may not be safe." "Not tomorrow, possibly the day after. So my entire life is currently—" She stopped, pressed her fingers against her temple. "Dante, I manage communications for a living. My value to my clients is stability and discretion and the appearance of having things under control. If it becomes known that I am personally associated with a federal investigation involving organized crime, it won't become known." "You can't guarantee that." "I can guarantee a great deal more than you're currently crediting me with," he said. "But you're right that I can't guarantee everything. No one can." She turned from the window. His face in the room's low light was the face she'd been learning to read over the past 48 hours. The architecture of a man whose interior was more complex than the controlled surface suggested, whose honesty, when it came, arrived without varnish. "I need to know everything," she said. "Not the careful version. Everything. Who the Valenti people are, what they want, how exposed I am, what the federal investigation looks like from your side, and what you intend to do about the men who went near my assistant." She held his gaze. "If I'm in this, and it appears that I am whether I chose it or not, then I need the full picture." He looked at her for a long moment. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He talked for 40 minutes. She did not interrupt. What she learned in those 40 minutes was the architecture of something much larger than a charity gala and a bad ex-boyfriend. The Valenti group had been moving on Chicago's infrastructure, aside. Not criminally, not crudely, but through the financial channels that ran beneath legitimate business, the ones that acquired leverage quietly. Graham had been a key node. The federal investigation that Dante had triggered was real and was moving, but it was moving through channels that the Valenti group had their own contacts inside, which meant the investigation itself was not the clean instrument it appeared to be from outside. And there was one more thing, Dante told it last, in the way people told the things they'd been calculating the cost of. "The federal contact I used to transfer Graham's files," he said. "His name is Reeves. Agent Reeves. Organized Crime Division." A pause. "This morning, Reeves contacted me to confirm the files were received. This evening, 3 hours ago, Reeves contacted me again. He has been approached by Valenti's people. He has been offered, significantly, to bury specific portions of the filing and redirect the investigation's focus. Vivian felt the room change temperature. "He told you this?" she said. "He told me he was considering it," Dante said, "which is his version of telling me he's already decided." The silence between them had a different quality now. "So the investigation," she said slowly, "may be redirected to focus on someone other than Graham and the Valenti group." "Yes. And the most visible alternative target," she said, "would be the person who was publicly associated with triggering it." Dante held her gaze. "You," she said. "And anyone currently visible in my proximity," he said. The cold thing in her sternum had become something else entirely. Not fear exactly, but its more functional cousin, the clear-eyed recognition of a situation's actual dimensions. She was sitting in Dante Moretti's lakefront apartment at 11 o'clock at night, unable to return to her building, with her assistant frightened and her professional life sitting on a fault line, and the federal investigation she had involuntarily become adjacent to was in the process of being purchased and redirected toward the man beside her and everyone near him, including her. "I need you to understand something," Dante said. His voice had the stripped quality she'd heard on the phone the previous night, the voice beneath the measured weight. "I did not want this for you. I want to be absolutely clear about that. What I did at the gala, I believed would be contained, clean. I was wrong about how far Graham's connections ran and how fast they'd respond. That's on me." "It is," she agreed. "But I also need you to understand that where we are right now," he stopped, which was, she had learned, significant. Dante Moretti did not stop mid-sentence for small reasons. The choice in front of you isn't between safety and risk. The Valenti people have already identified you. The choice is between facing that with resources and facing it without them. Resources meaning you. Yes. She sat in the chair in her burgundy dress and looked at a man who had walked into her life 48 hours ago in a fire-lit library and had, with complete honesty and incomplete disclosure, rearranged everything. She thought about her firm, her 11 people, Priya driving to a friend's apartment right now because the choice she'd made to answer an unknown number had put her assistant in a parking structure with men asking questions. She thought about Graham's face at the gala, the planned humiliation, the years of careful dismantling, the revelation that even his cruelty might have been a tool in someone else's operation. She thought about the burgundy dress in the closet for 18 months. She looked at Dante. "What do you need from me?" she said. Something in his face shifted. Not relief, nothing that simple, but the particular quality of a man who had asked a genuine question and received a genuine answer and understood exactly what it... Something in his face shifted. Not relief, nothing that simple, but the particular quality of a man who had asked a genuine question and received a genuine answer and understood exactly what it cost her to give it. "I need you to trust me for 72 hours, he said. "That's a long time." "I know." "And after 72 hours? After 72 hours, Graham Sterling will no longer be a problem. Reeves will no longer be a problem. And the Valenti group will have enough of their own difficulties to stop caring about either of us." She looked at him for a long moment. "All right," she said. 72 hours. She did not sleep well. Dante had given her the apartment's secondary bedroom. No performance around it, no suggestion of anything else. Simply the practical allocation of space in a secure location. She lay in the dark with the lake somewhere beyond the wall, and her mind running the kind of inventory that refused to stop for something as trivial as 3 in the morning. She was still awake at 4 when she heard him in the main room. The low murmur of a call, the particular quality of his voice in operational mode, clipped and final. She did not go out. She lay in the dark and listened to the city's distant pulse and understood, with the clarity that came only in the genuinely sleepless hours, that she had crossed a threshold she could not uncross. She was not afraid of that. That, she realized, was the more significant information. By morning, the 72-hour clock had started running and Dante's operation was already moving. He explained it over coffee at the kitchen counter, standing, both of them with the compressed alertness of people who had slept inadequately and were running on something more functional than rest. He had 4 teams. The first was already positioned around Valenti's Chicago contact, a man named Corso, who operated a legitimate shipping concern on the south side and who served as the organizational nerve center for everything the Valenti group ran in the Midwest. The second was handling Reeves, not threatening him, but documenting his contact with Valenti's people in enough detail to make his cooperation with them a professional suicide note. The third was with Graham. And the fourth? She asked. With you, he said. 2 people. You won't see them, but they'll be there. She drank her coffee. I need to go to my office. I know. My clients have a right to reach me. My team. Go, he said. Live your life as normally as possible. Abnormal behavior creates visibility. Visibility creates problems. He looked at her over his own cup. Can you do that? I've been performing normal under pressure since I was 22, she said. Yes, I can do that. She went home first, to change. The 2 people Dante had mentioned were invisible as promised. She didn't identify them on the street or in the elevator, which was either reassuring or unsettling depending on the angle she looked at it from. She spent the day at her office. She answered calls, reviewed copy, sat in a strategy meeting about a medical foundation's annual report. She was present and functional and professional, and she felt, the entire day, like someone performing a very familiar role while a different drama ran beneath the stage, audible only as a low vibration through the floor. Priya came in at 10, looking the specific way people looked when they'd processed fear overnight, and arrived at the other side of it, tired, a degree more brittle than usual, but present. You okay? Vivian asked quietly, in her office with the door closed. I'm fine, Priya paused. Are you? Working on it. The Tribune this morning. Priya's eyes were careful. Sterling Capital Group. The investigation is widening. They're mentioning undisclosed partners, offshore accounts. Vivian, is this going to... It won't touch us, Vivian said. I promise you it won't touch the firm. Priya looked at her for a moment with the specific look of a person deciding how much they believed something. Okay, she said finally. On the second day, the vibration through the floor got louder. Dante called at 7 in the morning. Reeves made his decision, he said. He took the Valenti offer. She was standing at her apartment window with her first coffee, watching the street below where she could now, if she looked carefully, identify one of the 2 people. So the investigation redirects, she said. It already has. As of this morning, the federal filing's primary focus has shifted. The Valenti shell companies are being framed as Moretti fronts. A pause. My name is in the amended filing. The coffee cup was warm in both hands. How bad? She said. Manageable, he said. If we move in the next 36 hours. What do you need? There's a meeting tonight. Corso is bringing Valenti's financial director to Chicago, a man named Ferrante. They're meeting at a location in Bridgeport to finalize the restructured filing strategy with Reeves. If we can document that meeting, document it how? Recording, physical presence of a witness, enough to make the documented evidence of Reeves's corruption irrefutable and to tie Ferrante directly to the filing manipulation. He paused. My people can handle the documentation, but I need a clean chain of custody for anything captured, something that doesn't trace back to me, something that holds up. She understood what he was not quite saying. You need someone whose credibility is unimpeachable, she said. Someone with no criminal record, no organizational affiliation, no reason to be dismissed as a compromised source. Yes, he said, you need me. He was quiet for a moment. I'm not asking you to do this, he said. I know. What would it involve? He told her. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she stood at the window for a long moment, looking at the street below and the ordinary morning proceeding across it. All right, she said. Vivian, 36 hours, you said. Tell me where to be and when. The location in Bridgeport was a private dining room above a social club that had operated on the same block since the 1970s. The kind of place that appeared on no relevant lists and that was known, in certain registers of the city, as a location where conversations happened that required discretion in both directions. Vivienne arrived at 8:45 in a car that wasn't hers, wearing clothes she had been given. Dark, unremarkable, the specific unremarkability of a wardrobe designed to not register. She had been briefed twice. She understood the mechanics. She had a device she'd been shown how to operate, small enough to be invisible, positioned in a specific way. She was terrified. She did not perform the tear. She located it, acknowledged it with the same measured process she applied to every difficult thing, and set it in a compartment that would hold it until later. This was a skill she had built over years of walking into rooms where she was the only person present who understood that the entire situation was actually about something other than what it appeared to be about. She was good at this. The dining room had a bar area accessible from the street entrance that served as a plausible reason for a woman to be present on the premises. Dante's people had arranged for her to be there as part of a private function that was real enough to hold up to a first look. She sat at a corner table with a drink she didn't touch and waited. At 9:15, Corso arrived. She had been shown a photograph. The reality of him was consistent with it. A compact man in his 60s, silver-haired, the kind of physical presentation that wanted to read as distinguished and nearly achieved it. He moved through the room with the casual authority of someone for whom this location was home territory, greeting two men near the entrance before heading up the back stairs. At 9:23, Reeves arrived. Seeing him in person produced something specific and cold in her chest. He was younger than she'd imagined, mid-40s, fit, the unremarkable professional presentation of a federal agent not in uniform. He had the look of a man who had been making a decision for several days and had finished making it and was now simply executing, the particular flatness of someone who had resolved their internal conflict by burying it. He went up the stairs without looking at her. At 9:31, Ferrante arrived. And everything changed, because Ferrante was not alone. Behind Ferrante, moving through the entrance with the practiced ease of a man who had been in this room before, was Graham Sterling. Vivian's hand went very still on the table. Graham, pale, diminished from the gala's version of him, wearing the compressed expression of a man operating on desperation's fuel, followed Ferrante through the room without looking at anything but the stairs ahead. He had not been in any of Dante's briefings. He had not been part of any anticipated variable. She reached beneath the table and confirmed the device was running. Her fingers were completely steady. She was watching her own hands with a faint remote surprise at their steadiness. She waited 17 minutes. She knew the timing from the briefing, the documentation window, the signal she was waiting for, the exit sequence. She sat at the corner table and drank nothing and watched the entrance and the stairs and kept her breathing measured in the way her therapist had taught her. The way that had initially been about surviving conversations with Graham and was now, in the sharpest possible irony, helping her survive a room Graham had just walked into upstairs. At 9:48, the signal came, a brief, specific thing from across the room that meant what it was designed to mean. She stood. She picked up her coat. She moved to the exit with the unhurried ease of someone who had finished their evening and was leaving at a natural pace. She was 4 steps from the door when someone grabbed her arm. Not hard enough to bruise, hard enough to stop her. She turned. The man was one she didn't recognize. Late 30s, dark jacket, the particular physical quality of someone whose job involved physical qualities. He was not looking at her with aggression. He was looking at her with the flat professional attention of someone executing an instruction. "Mr. Ferrante would like a word," he said. Her heart was doing something loud and complex behind her ribs. "I don't know who that is," she said. "He knows who you are." The man's hand was still on her arm. Not tight, but present. The communication of non-negotiability without violence. "Upstairs, it'll be brief." She looked at the door. 4 steps. The car was outside and Dante's people were outside, and she was 4 steps from both of them. She looked at the man. She went upstairs. The private dining room held 4 men and a table. Corso sat at the head. Reeves sat to his left with the look of someone who had been told an unexpected complication had arrived and was processing it with the specific dread of a man who had already made his bad decision and couldn't unmake it. Graham was standing near the far wall, and when he saw her, he went the color of old chalk. Ferrante was at the table's center. He was not what she'd expected. 60s, heavy set, with the particular stillness of a man who had arrived at his level of power by being routinely underestimated by people who read his physicality as slow. His eyes were not slow. "Miss Mercer," he said. "Sit down." "I'd rather stand," she said. He looked at her for a moment, then, almost imperceptibly, a shift. Not a smile, but its structural precedent. "All right," he said. "I'll be direct. You're here tonight in a capacity that involves Mr. Moretti's interests. I don't need to know the specifics. What I need to know is whether you understand the situation you're currently in." "I understand it," she said. "Good." He laced his fingers together on the table.
then you also understand that you are, at this moment, the single most useful piece on a board that has many pieces. Not because of anything you've done, because of who you're connected to and what you've been carrying tonight. His eyes were completely still. We're not interested in hurting you. We're interested in a simple exchange. What you've documented tonight in exchange for your firm's complete insulation from everything that follows. Your people, your clients, your professional life, untouched, clean, guaranteed. The room was very quiet. She could hear her own pulse. "And if I decline," she said. Ferrante's expression did not change. "The amended federal filing moves forward. Your name appears as a material witness with described connections to the Moretti organization. Your firm's clients receive an anonymous briefing on those connections tomorrow morning." A pause. "You're a communications professional. You know what that does to a firm built on discretion and trust." She looked at him. She looked at Reeves, whose eyes were on the table. She looked at Graham, who was still standing at the wall, and she watched something move through his face when their eyes met. Not apology, he didn't have that currency, but something raw, something that looked almost like the shame that should have arrived years ago and had finally found its address. She looked back at Ferrante. "I need a minute," she said. He gestured toward the far corner. She walked to it, turned her back to the room, and stood facing the wall with her hands at her sides, and her heart loud in her ears, and the device running beneath her jacket, and everything she had built over 10 years of work sitting on the other side of this decision. She thought about Priya. She thought about her 11 people who came to work every morning because she had built something worth coming to. She thought about the burgundy dress in the closet for 18 months. She thought about a firelit library and a man who had listened to her break apart and had not looked away. She turned around. "I have a counter," she said. Ferrante raised an eyebrow. "The device I'm carrying," she said, "has been transmitting since I entered this building. Not recording, transmitting, live. To a receiver that is currently outside with people who have been listening to everything said in this room for the last 4 minutes. She kept her voice level with the entire force of everything she'd ever built. "Which means Mr. Moretti is already aware of your offer, and the question of whether I hand you what I have is no longer the most important question in this room." Ferrante's stillness was absolute. Reeves looked up from the table for the first time. Graham made a sound that wasn't quite a word. "The most important question," she continued, "is whether the people outside this door come through it in the next 2 minutes because I give them a reason to, or whether this conversation ends differently." She looked directly at Ferrante. "I am not a piece on your board. I am not a leverage point or an asset or a complication to be managed. I am the person who is currently deciding how this evening ends, and I am telling you that your offer is declined." 3 things happened almost simultaneously. Her phone vibrated once in her pocket. Dante's signal, the one that meant his people were in position and waiting on her word. The door at the top of the stairs opened, and Graham Sterling, with the desperate calculus of a man who had run out of every other option, lunged across the room toward the table where a secondary phone sat beside Ferrante's water glass. Reaching for it with the panicked intention of someone trying to make a call that would change the geometry of the next 60 seconds before the geometry changed without. Graham's hand never reached the phone. Dante came through the door first, not running, not with a weapon drawn or a voice raised. He came through the door the way he moved through every space, with the absolute physical certainty of a man who had already decided the outcome before entering the room, and whose body simply proceeded to confirm it. Behind him came 2 men whose names Vivian did not know, and whose presence communicated everything that needed communicating without a word being said. Graham's outstretched arm froze in the air above the table. The room went completely still. Ferrante did not move. He sat with his hands still laced on the table and his eyes moving between Dante and Vivian with the flat calculation of a man running numbers on a situation that had just changed significantly. Corso had pushed back from his chair by half an inch. The involuntary recoil of a man whose body had made a decision his composure was trying to override. Reeves was looking at the wall. Dante crossed the room without hurrying and stopped beside Vivian. He did not look at her immediately. He looked at Ferrante. "Luca," he said. Ferrante said nothing for a moment. Then, "Dante." The 2 names in the room had the quality of 2 objects being set down on the same table. A recognition, a measuring, the specific register of men who had a history that predated this evening by years and who were now standing on opposite sides of something that could not be walked back from.
"This is finished," Dante said. "It's not finished," Ferrante said. "We're having a conversation. You were offering my associate a choice between compliance and professional destruction." Dante's voice was the same voice it always was. Not elevated, not cold, simply weighted with the certainty of a man who had stopped performing anything several decades ago. "That's not a conversation. That's an ultimatum. And the answer is no." Ferrante looked at him steadily. "You've been building to this for 3 years." "I have." "And you think tonight closes it?" "Tonight closes enough of it." Dante glanced briefly at Reeves, who was still studying the wall with the focus of a man trying to disappear into architecture. "Agent Reeves, every conversation you've had with Ferrante's people in the past 72 hours has been documented. The offer made to you, your acceptance, your cooperation in amending the federal filing, it's all there. You can make this significantly worse for yourself, or you can start making it less bad. Those are currently your only options." Reeves closed his eyes. He looked like a man absorbing the structural failure of something he'd spent years building and had taken apart with his own hands in the space of 3 days. "I want counsel," he said. "That's a smart decision," Dante said. "Make the call." Reeves took his phone from his pocket with the movements of a man underwater and walked to the far end of the room. Ferrante watched him go. Then he looked back at Dante. "You understand this doesn't end here," Ferrante said. "Not with Reeves. Not with Sterling. The organization I represent has a longer memory than any of this." "I know," Dante said. "So do I." He held Ferrante's gaze for a long moment. The specific duration of 2 men communicating something that existed beneath the register of anything being said aloud, the compressed language of people who understood each other's actual capabilities and were acknowledging, with the economy of the experienced, exactly where the lines were drawn. Then Ferrante nodded. Once. The nod of a man who had calculated the cost of escalation and found it, for this specific evening, too high. He stood. He buttoned his jacket with the meticulous care of a man restoring his composure 1 layer at a time. He looked at Vivian, not with hostility, not with anything particularly readable, simply with the flat acknowledgement of someone recalibrating an assessment. "You made a decision tonight that has consequences," he said to her. "I know," she said. "As long as you know." He left. Corso, after a brief exchange with Dante's men, followed. The room emptied with a speed that felt almost surgical. The organized crime social contract of knowing when an evening was concluded and proceeding accordingly. Which left Graham. He was still standing near the wall where he had been standing when Dante came through the door. His arm was at his side now. His face had the quality of something that had been through several states of collapse and had arrived at a specific, final version of itself. Not the arranged dignity of the gala, not the compressed desperation of a man on federal watch lists, but something rawer and more fundamental. The face of a person who had run out of versions of themselves to perform. He was looking at Vivian. She looked back at him. The room around them, the Bridgeport Social Club dining room with its cheap landscape paintings and its table of water glasses and the chair where Ferrante had just sat, was not the room she would have chosen for this. But the moment had arrived in this room and she was in it, and she let herself be in it fully, without the managed distance she'd spent years perfecting. "I didn't know it would go this far," Graham said. His voice was quiet. Not the calibrated quiet she was accustomed to from him, not the frequency engineered to make her feel small, but the genuine quiet of a man who was simply tired of the machinery. The machinery had stopped working, and the voice beneath it was smaller than she remembered. "Which part?" she said. "Any of it." He looked at his hands. "The gala. Yes. I knew who Moretti was. Ferrante told me there was a possibility he'd be there. He told me that a public confrontation involving Moretti might create visibility that could be useful." He stopped. "He didn't tell me to do what I did, what I said to you. That was—" He stopped again. "That was you," she said. "Yes." He looked up. "That was me. That's the part I can't—" He pressed his lips together. "The other things. The financial connections, the filing, the federal exposure. Those were decisions I made over time, incrementally, and I told myself the same thing people tell themselves about those kinds of decisions. That each one was just this one, she said. He looked at her. Yes, I know, she said. You told me the same thing about us. Each criticism was just this one. Each thing that was wrong with me was just this one specific thing that I could fix if I tried harder. She held his gaze. You were very good at the incremental. He had nothing to say to that. Did you ever love me? She asked. The question came out without weight. Not an accusation, not a wound reopening, but a genuine question from a woman who had spent 18 months circling it and wanted, finally, a straight answer. Graham was quiet for a long moment. I think I did, he said. At the beginning. He exhaled. Before I got into the habit of making myself feel better by making you feel worse. That habit is a rot. It starts small, and by the time you see what it's done, you're so far into it that... He stopped. That's not an excuse. I know it's not. No, she agreed. It's not. He nodded. What happens to me now? He said. She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had been the architecture of her worst years, who had built himself so thoroughly into her self-perception that dismantling him had required a therapist and 18 months of deliberate reconstruction, and in the end, a night in a fire-lit library with a stranger who had looked at her like she was worth looking at. That depends entirely on the choices you make in the next 24 hours, Dante said from behind her. Graham looked at him. You cooperate fully with the federal investigation, Dante said. The real investigation, not Reeves's redirected version. You provide a complete account of your connections to the Valenti Group, the shell companies, the financial channels. You do this voluntarily before you're compelled to. That cooperation doesn't save you from the consequences of what you've done, but it determines the scale of those consequences. He paused. That's the only version of the next chapter of your life that doesn't end in a way I'd prefer not to describe in detail. Graham looked at him for a long time. Then he looked at Vivian. I'm sorry, he said, for what I said to you at the gala. All of it. I know it doesn't. You're right, she said. It doesn't. She picked up her coat from the chair where she'd set it. But I heard you. And that's the last time we do this, Graham. Whatever you do next, wherever it takes you, I'm not a part of it. Not even as something you're apologizing for. She walked past him toward the door. She heard him exhale behind her, a long, ragged sound, the specific sound of a man setting down something he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten its weight was not his own. She went downstairs and out into the Bridgeport night, and she breathed the cold April air and stood on the sidewalk and felt, not triumph, nothing that clean, but something more sustainable than triumph. The particular sensation of having gone through something at full cost and come out the other side still herself. Dante came out 2 minutes later. He stood beside her on the sidewalk. Neither of them said anything for a moment. The device, she said finally, everything it captured is already where it needs to be. He looked at the street. Reeves will cooperate. He doesn't have another option. The amended filing gets withdrawn. The investigation returns to its original structure, with Ferrante's people added to the scope. And the Valenti Group will be busy with federal scrutiny for the next several years, busy enough to lose interest in Chicago. He paused. They have a long memory, but they also have a very acute sense of cost-benefit. Pressing this situation from here generates costs they won't consider proportionate to the return. You're sure? I'm sure enough, he said, which is, in my experience, the best available version of sure. She looked at the street. A car went past, an ordinary car, someone going somewhere ordinary, the city's nocturnal business proceeding with no knowledge of anything. My firm, she said. We'll be fine, he said. I give you my word on that specifically. Nothing that happened tonight connects to you in any way that reaches your clients or your people. She nodded. Priya, she said, is safe. Has been safe since last night. She nodded again. She was running the inventory, she realized. The methodical check of every point of exposure, every person she was responsible for, every component of the life she had built. The professional mechanism running its post-crisis audit. She let it run because it was useful, and because it was also, she recognized, displacement, the part of her that knew there was a different inventory to run and was deferring it. I need to ask you something, she said. Yes. If I hadn't been at that gala,
If we'd never met in the library. She looked at him. Would you have cared what Graham Sterling said to me? He was quiet for a moment. No, he said. Because I was irrelevant. Because I didn't know you. He turned to look at her directly. The world is full of cruelty I don't intervene in, not because it doesn't exist, but because I'm not in a position to address all of it, and I don't pretend to be. He held her gaze. You were not a cause I took up. You were a person I met. That's a different thing entirely. And everything that followed served my purposes and yours simultaneously, he said. I told you that honestly. I also told you that what I felt in that library and after was real. I'm telling you again. Both things were true at once. I don't know how to make that simpler. She looked at him for a long moment. It's not simple, she said. No, he agreed. I'm not sure what to do with it. Neither am I, he said, which is, in my experience, not a reason to stop. The next days unfolded the way significant things unfolded, not with clean narrative resolution, but with the complicated texture of actual consequence. Reeves cooperated. The amended federal filing was withdrawn within 48 hours, the withdrawal attributed to procedural irregularities in the documentation chain, the bureaucratic language of an institution correcting itself without advertising why. The original investigation resumed with expanded scope. 3 names appeared in the expanded filing that had not been there before. Graham Sterling entered a voluntary cooperation agreement with federal prosecutors on the 4th day. His attorney announced it in a brief statement that used the word proactive 4 times. Sterling Capital Group suspended operations pending the investigation's resolution. The Tribune ran it as a business story, not a crime story, which was the particular mercy of a city that had learned to grade on a curve. Vivian read the Tribune over coffee. Her own coffee, in her own kitchen, in her own apartment, to which she had returned without incident, and felt the same thing she'd felt in the Bridgeport room when she heard Graham's exhausted exhale, not triumph, the end of a particular wait. She went to work. She sat in her office and did the work, and her 11 people came in and did their work, and the firm's business continued with the particular resilience of things that had been built by someone who understood that resilience was not the absence of damage, but the structural capacity to absorb it and continue. Priya appeared in her doorway at 10 on the first morning back, with 2 coffees, and the specific look of a woman who had decided she was owed an explanation and was going to collect it. "Sit down," Vivian said. Priya sat. Vivian told her most of it. Not all. There were portions that belonged to Dante and to the mechanics of what had happened that served no purpose in the telling. But the shape of it, Graham's connections, the federal investigation, the meeting in Bridgeport and what she'd done there. She told it flat and factual, without the emotional scaffolding she might have used in another context. Priya listened without interrupting. When she finished, Priya was quiet for a long moment. "You transmitted live," she said. "Yes." "That was, Vivian, that was either incredibly smart or incredibly—" "I know," Vivian said. Priya looked at her coffee cup. "Are you okay?" "I think so." She paused. "Ask me again in a few weeks." "And Moretti?" Vivian looked at her. "I'm asking as someone who was in a parking structure being questioned about your associations," Priya said. "I think that entitles me to ask." "It does," Vivian said. "I don't have a clean answer yet. But there's something." "There's something," she said. Priya nodded once, the nod of a woman filing information carefully. "Okay," she said. "Then I'll ask again in a few weeks." 2 weeks after the night in Bridgeport, Dante called. Not the operational voice, not the stripped version. The other one, the one she'd heard in the car going north and over dinner in the West Loop restaurant, the one that existed beneath the machinery of who he had to be in every professional and organizational capacity of his life. "How's the firm?" he said. "Good," she said. "Steady." "You're sleeping." "Better than I was." She paused. "How are you?" "Operational." A brief pause. "Managing the post-storm inventory?" "Same," she said. A silence that was not uncomfortable. "I'd like to see you," he said. She stood at her apartment window, the same window where she'd stood taking calls in the compressed days of the crisis, the same amber morning light, the same street below where the ordinary city conducted its ordinary business.
Not a dinner with implications, she said. Not somewhere that announces things.
All right.
Somewhere we can just... She stopped, looked for the word. Talk, without the city watching. I know a place, he said. He picked her up on a Saturday morning in a car that was not the black Mercedes. A simpler car, the kind that moved through the city without commentary. He was in jeans, a dark jacket, without the armor of the suit. She had worn something comfortable and had not thought about it much, which was its own kind of information. He drove north along the lakefront. She had not asked where they were going, and he had not said, and the absence of that exchange felt easy in a way that not many things felt easy. They ended up at a park on the city's far north side, one of the narrow lakeshore parks that existed in the gap between the residential neighborhoods and the water, the kind that belonged primarily to the people who lived nearest them and that the city at large forgot about. He parked and they walked out onto the grass toward the water, and the April air had finally, in the 2 weeks since the gala, begun to mean something like spring. They sat on a low outcropping of rock above the water. The lake was the particular gray-green of early spring, moving with the low chop of an offshore wind, and the city's skyline was visible to the south in the middle distance. Not looming, not overwhelming, simply present, the way the city was always present in Chicago, woven into every sightline. She thought about the night she'd come home from the gala and sat by her window watching the amber light and thinking about the way the ballroom had parted. She had been thinking about a feeling she'd forgotten, the feeling of moving through space without bracing. She was not bracing now. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "What is this like for you?" She looked at the water. Whatever this is, what's it like from where you're sitting?" He was quiet for a moment. "Unfamiliar," he said. "How?" He looked at the water alongside her. "I've spent 19 years in a life where everyone in it has a specific relationship to what I am before they have a relationship to who I am. People who work for me, people who oppose me, people who want things from the organization, people who are afraid." He paused. "You were afraid of me briefly, in the library." "Yes," she said. "And then you weren't." "No. That was..." He stopped. Restarted. "When you stopped being afraid and started just looking at me. That was unfamiliar." He turned to look at her. "You looked at me like a person." She met his eyes. "You are a person," she said. "I know that," he said. "I'd forgotten what it felt like when someone else confirmed it." The water moved below them. A gull crossed overhead, angling into the wind. She thought about the Bridgeport room, about standing in the corner with her back to Ferrante and running the inventory of everything she had to lose and then turning around and speaking anyway. She had told herself in the moment that she did it for the device, for the documentation, for the outcome Dante needed. All of that was true. She also knew that some portion of it, the steadiness of her hands, the flatness of her voice, the absolute refusal to be a piece on someone else's board, had nothing to do with Dante's operation. That part had been hers, built from something that had been there before Graham dismantled it, and that had, in the compressed extraordinary days of the past weeks, found its way back to the surface. "I went to therapy this week," she said. He looked at her. "First session since all of this." She looked at her hands. "My therapist said something. She said that healing isn't linear and it isn't always gentle. Sometimes it happens in the middle of things that are hard and you don't notice it's happening until afterward." She paused. "I think she was right." "She sounds competent," he said. Vivian smiled. It was a small smile, the unself-conscious kind. "She is." He was watching her with the look she had learned, the direct, complete attention, the one that had no social performance in it. "I'm not an easy person to be near," he said. "The life doesn't change because my perspective on it has. The risk doesn't decrease. The complications don't..." "I know," she said. "I'm telling you clearly." "I heard you clearly." She looked back at the water. "I'm also someone who built something real from nothing with inadequate resources in a world that mostly didn't care if I succeeded. I'm familiar with complicated and high stakes." She paused. "I'm not looking for easy." "What are you looking for?" he said. She thought about it honestly, the way she'd been trying to think about things since the library, without the managed distance, without the professional mechanism running interference. "Someone who looks at me like I'm worth looking at," she said.
and tells me the truth even when it's complicated. She met his eyes. The rest I can figure out as we go. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he reached over and took her hand. Not dramatically, not the gesture of a scene being performed, not the choreography of a moment being constructed. He simply took her hand the way you took the hand of someone whose hand you wanted to hold, with the quiet certainty of someone who had decided and was proceeding. She let him. They sat on the rock above the lake with the city visible behind them and the water moving below and the April wind carrying the particular smell of the lake in spring, cold and mineral and alive, and stayed there without talking for a while, which was, she was discovering, one of the things she valued most about him. The ability to be in silence together without either of them needing to fill it. After a while, she said, "Graham called me." He said nothing. His hand didn't move. His attorney, technically, asking if I'd be willing to speak to prosecutors about our personal history, providing context for the cooperation agreement. She looked at the water. I said yes. You didn't have to. I know. She paused. But it closes it, properly, on my terms, not his. She looked at Dante. Is that? Yes, he said. That's right. She nodded. The sun had moved while they sat there, the spring sun that arrived at a low angle and moved quickly, throwing the light across the lake's surface in a way that changed the color of the water from gray-green to something warmer. The city's skyline to the south caught it differently too, the steel and glass going briefly gold before the angle shifted again. She thought about the ballroom of the Blackstone Grand and the woman who had walked into it in a navy dress designed to make her disappear. She thought about that woman's hands around a champagne glass she never drank from, and the 40 feet she'd almost made before Graham's voice found her, and the library door, and the chair in the corner of the darkened room where someone was already sitting. She thought about how close it had been, how nearly she had left the library immediately, how nearly she had performed the dignified exit and gone home and poured herself into the ordinary insulation of her apartment and her routines and her carefully managed grief. She was very glad she hadn't. Hey, she said. He looked at her. Thank you, she said, for the library, not the ballroom, not the federal investigation, just the library. For sitting there and not leaving while She stopped. For staying. He looked at her for a moment with something in his face that she had not seen before. Not the controlled assessment, not the operational stillness, but something more unguarded. Something that had the quality of things that had been kept in careful storage and were being, for the first time in a long time, exposed to air. I wasn't going anywhere, he said. She leaned her shoulder against his. He adjusted slightly to accommodate it, the small physical negotiation of two people learning the geography of being close to each other, and then they were still. Below them, the lake continued its old, indifferent work, the water that had been there before the city and would be there after, that had no opinion about any of it, that simply moved and moved and moved. Above the park, Chicago's spring sky was the particular blue that arrived only after long winters, earned, specific, the blue of something that had waited a long time for its proper season and was now, without apology, fully here. She breathed it in. The weight that had lived in her chest for 3 years, the weight with Graham's voice in it, his inventory looks, his calibrated quiet, all the machinery of a man who had needed her diminished in order to feel large, was not entirely gone. She was honest enough to know it would take longer than a few weeks. Her therapist was honest enough to have told her so, but it was lighter. Measurably, specifically, genuinely lighter. She was 34 years old. She had built something real. She was sitting on a rock above Lake Michigan with a man who told her the truth in complicated situations and held her hand without making a production of it. And somewhere on the south side of the city, a federal investigation was doing the work it was supposed to do. And her firm was open and her people were working and Priya was fine. And the woman who had walked into the Blackstone Grand in a navy dress designed to make her disappear was not, at this particular moment, trying to disappear at all. She was right here, fully, without apology, exactly where she was. The wind came off the lake and she did not lean away from it. She let it hit her face, cold and clean and real, and she stayed.